Hi, greetings. My name is Monroe France, and I'm Associate Vice President for Global Engagement and Inclusive Leadership at NYU. I'm so happy to be joining you today from New York City, where I'm on the land of the Lenape people. I want to recognize our indigenous communities for the lands in which that we all sit on. Moreover, I want to also recognize the labor and the disproportionate impact of many marginalized communities during this very difficult time that we're all experiencing in this moment. Today, I'm going to speak with you a bit about my approach and practice to creating a more inclusive educational environments, both in higher education and as well more broadly. I'm so excited for this conversation. I brought my tea. So I typically would love a cup of coffee, but right now I'm not able to drink coffee. So I have my tea here, and I think this tea mug is from Prague, which I'm very excited to bring in a little bit of the international and intercultural diversity as well in this time. So let me take a sip. And today I want to talk to you about sort of my approaches to creating a more inclusive campus environment and more inclusive educational environments as well, and sort of the frames that I use to do this work. I'm going to give you an overview, so I think a little bit about some of the terms and some of the frameworks that I use when I think about how do we create more inclusive environments, and as well talk about the different levels of creating change when you're embarking on creating a more inclusive environment, and then approaches for your own learning so that you're able to do that change in a thoughtful and informed way. And then finally, I'll share with you sort of some strategies for how you create structural and systemic change, and then give you a couple of my best authors, my favorite authors that I'm going to bring into our conversation today. So let me first start with some terms to kind of frame our conversation, because people will often conflate these terms together and think they're one thing, which they're not, right? So we have this concept of diversity, which is about the people and representation in organizations and environments, right? And so diversity is one goal about how do we think about the people and the ideas and the thoughts that exist within an environment and a framework. The other is this concept around inclusion, which I've already used, which is about how do we feel about our experiences there? Are we included in decision-making? Are we included in meetings? Are we included when it's the curriculum, right? And so do we see ourselves represented in the curriculum? Do we see ourselves represented in the leadership of an organization or an institution? And then we have this thing about equity, right? This is about the distribution of power and resources. We cannot do real true change around creating more inclusive environments unless we think about who has power and who has the resources and where those resources lie and the level of commitment that we make to advancing diversity and inclusion within an organization. And then finally, we get to this concept, which often people will, sort of use before they think about the diversity, equity, and inclusion, this concept around belonging, right? How do we have a sense of belonging as people who are underrepresented, or as people who've been historically disenfranchised in our institutions, in our societies? And that sense of belonging happens when we feel more included, when there's a redistribution of resources, and when we also have a diverse experience where we're able to see other people like us within an organization. So those are some concepts that just wanted to ensure that made clearer as a part of this conversation. And then I want to move on to when we think about creating change, right? When we're on this journey to impact change within our educational environments. So frames that we use at NYU is to think about sort of the 4 levels of creating change. So one is we think about who am I as individuals and sort of thinking about our own identities and our own thought processes and the ways in which that we continue to perpetuate disenfranchisement or perpetuate oppression or perpetuate racism, et cetera, and other forms of bias. And so we have to think about that change. Then the next change is the interpersonal. So this is how we experience each other one-on-one and the ways in which that either people in power treat people who are historically underrepresented or marginalized in educational environments. And then you have the piece around, okay, thought about myself, thinking about the interpersonal, and we can't just stop there. Often in this work, right? Often in the work of advancing and creating campus and institutional changes, we often want to just look at the ways in which that people are or not biased or racist or homophobic or sexist, etc. And then the ways people treat people. But it has to go beyond that to create true change. We then must also look at the institutional structures. What are the ways in which that the institution continues to perpetuate disenfranchisement or marginalization of underrepresented communities or those that have been historically disenfranchised? And then we have to think about the structural change. Now, this is the work that often lots of organizations and lots of institutions don't really want to do, because it's about how do we dismantle the structures that continue to perpetuate and embed this in the ways that we do everyday practice and teaching and education and learning within our communities. But the structural change must happen if we want to see sustained change. If we want to see our actions really in the work that we do really live beyond the people. So that when I'm not in my institution or other people who I would say are well-meaning people and good people like me or trying to do this work, the work should live beyond me. The work should live beyond those of us who are at the helm of creating that change. And that's because we changed the structure and the institutional practices. And how do we do some of that work, right? And so what I would say is that we must look at the people. Who are the people? How do we educate the people? How do we ensure that the people have the tools they need to in leadership roles, in positions of power, when they're in a classroom, when they're making policy decisions, when they're creating educational structures, when they're constructing the institution and creating programs, et cetera? How do we ensure that they're doing that with a sense of a commitment to inclusion and advancing diversity and equity? And then we have to think about then moving to the policies, right? Again, going back to that, how do we create institutional change that sustains beyond us, right? And dismantling the very core of how institutions structure or rethinking them or remapping them. And so the way to do that is we have to also take a diagnostic of policies and begin to make changes in policies and along with the educating the people. And once we get people, the policies, then we have to think about our programs and our resources. So in an educational environment, it's often when we think about the programs and the resources and creating new programs and resources or evaluating the ones that continue to perpetuate bias and harm to underrepresented communities. We have to then look at that. What are new policies, new programs that we need to put into place? And then we have to look at the research. None of this work, especially in educational environments, can be done without research. So when I say that, I mean that we have to really look at the scholarship, look at data, look at empirical data, look at research that really within your field that informs the work. And so it's going to look different, let's say in the sciences. It's going to look different in terms of how do you advance diversity and equity rather than we look in the arts. Or it's going to look different within a cultural context in the US than it does in parts of Canada, for example. And so we have to think about the ways in which that research informs our praxis, and also within a cultural context, within a disciplinary context, within a sector context, right? And also within an industry context. And so in education, it's going to look different than it does in corporate in terms of the research that we use to inform and to shape our practice. People, policies, program and resources, and research, all four, in order to do the deep change in terms of moving institutions and creating sustained change. And then if we're in the midst of all of this, what should we be doing as individuals, right? In terms of our process as we're doing the advocacy or as we're leading this change, or either just as we're just doing our own work, our own internal work, to become better educators that are committed to advancing change within institutional environments, or just better employees, better people in the world, right? And so we think about this learning and action model, right? And so this personal learning action model, which I refer to as my own sort of acronym for the model that I use, is the RIPA, that you have to have reflection. So what are you reflecting on who you are and reflecting on sort of what your own practices are? Then once you reflect and identify, where are my growth areas? And so when you think about sort of a growth mindset, a lifelong learning mindset, you reflect on who you are, And then you begin to do, where are my gaps? Where are the opportunities for me to grow, right? And then you start to do the learning, right? And so you do the reflection, and some people may also call it an assessment of yourself, and then you do the learning, right? And so you have to have a learning plan. And then with the learning plan, then you move on to, okay, so now I've done my reflection, I've done my reflection and assessment, I've done my learning, right? And now I have to think about my plan. And I said you have to have a learning plan, right? And then you also have to have a plan overall in terms of, where am I going to impact change? For myself as an individual, where am I going to do the work with my teams that I lead? Where I'm going to do the work in the classroom, if I'm like in a classroom teaching, where I'm going to do the work with my students. If I'm leading programs that are like travel programs that are getting people to study internationally, et cetera. What am I doing in the program curriculum to ensure that underrepresented people have a good experience? And then how am I going to take action to create change? And that action is like reflects back onto all the things that I've already said. If you use the things I've said before in terms of the frames and how you take your action, right? So research can inform your action. Your actions can be informed by like, okay, who are the people and what do the people need to that are underrepresented or that experience disproportionate impacts around institutional oppression, et cetera. And in my own learning plan, right, I have had a number of people, number of writers and researchers and scholars that have really informed my work. One of them is the most amazing and the most eloquent, Audre Lorde, right? And so she has been one of my Shiras that has really taught me and informed me in terms of how do you create sustained change in environments where you're not afraid to speak up, even if you're afraid that your words might be bruised, is what she said. So how are we deciding to speak up and not letting our fear make us become silent? And that's something else that Audre speaks about as well in her work. And then the other person, he is like, if I could be in tea with someone right now in this moment, in addition to being on camera, being in this conversation with you, I would say it's James Baldwin. Right. And so James Baldwin has been someone that has informed and shaped my work in the way I think about, like, how do we use our voice in the spirit of action and creating change? And one of the things that James says is that, or Jimmy Baldwin says, if you were to refer to him on a more personal level, what he said is that not all things faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So with that, I want to say thank you for joining my coffee talk, this moment in conversation with you, Prague, and say good luck with you're taking action and the work that you're doing to create change. Join us in this journey. Thank you so much.